This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Warriors episode 24. My name's Andy and I'm joined as usual by Leah and Jörg. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there. Say
hi, Jörg.
Hello.
Hi. So today we're going to talk about race in the Bible. We've been talking about the experience of different people and seen a great variety of experience. And as we record live, the sentencing of the man who murdered George Floyd is being announced. It's just been announced he got 22 years in prison. So the whole many different facets of the whole debate and issues around race are still very much live in our minds, and we've spoken to people who had lots of different perspectives. Today we thought we'd talk about what we see like written about race or demonstrated about race maybe in the Bible. We made up our homework about 10 minutes ago, listener, and we were going to pretend, but then Leah said we couldn't, so we have to be honest with you.
So am I like the conscience of the conscience?
Yeah. So not only did we make up our homework 10 minutes ago, but also we got Jörg to do our homework for us. So the homework today is find a passage in the Bible that is problematic and about race, or something like that.
Right.
Who wants to go first?
Well, actually, can I come back to the George Floyd sentencing? Is that allowed?
Yeah.
I just noticed the prosecutors asked for 30 years in prison.
Yeah.
He got 22, which in reality means he's going to serve some 11, 12. Mm-hmm. It's the first time he's first time he spoke, and he said he sent his condolences to the Floyd family. That's all really, really problematic, isn't it? I mean, the judge said it's all about the legality of it, but this is not likely to make the pain go away for a lot of people.
Yeah, so it says the judge has written like 22 pages of notes, and he just made some brief comments in words.
Yeah.
So he obviously had a lot to say, and that will need to be digested.
Right. But it's just, I mean, also just thinking about, I was wondering if actually, before we get into the Bible, just to even just reflect where we are, like, it almost seems like we're back to routine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You got a white person who murdered a black person who doesn't seem to get the kind of sentence he would have gotten if he was a black person. And there was less prominence attached to it or something. I don't know. It just doesn't feel like things are changing.
I don't know enough about American sentences for murder to know how that stacks. I mean, I know it said he could get up to 40 years.
Mm. Yeah, and the prosecutors asked for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, that will go down a bit, but yeah, I don't know.
And I think we're seeing something of a backlash in this country against Black Lives Matter. I mean, we had a report out this week from a parliamentary select committee on education, very much trying to turn the spotlight away from race as an issue in education and say that talking about race and white privilege is divisive and kind of that it causes more trouble than it solves, which is followed on the back of a previous report about a month ago, which was kind of the government's task force on.
Yeah. Well, it's Gavin Williamson trolling again, isn't it?
Yeah. So the recent report was saying that but white kids from working class families are the worst served by our education system. So that was their argument. That was the context of the argument that talking about white privilege was unhelpful.
But it was kind of saying more than that, because I mean, I don't think anyone would argue that that's not an issue. And if you read some of the responses from educationalists, it's like, yes, we know that white working class, particularly boys, really struggle in education, and it's a problem we're all aware of, and it's a problem people are working on, and if it was easy to fix, we would have fixed it by now. But what the report did is it set the two things in opposition to each other.
Yeah, it's not clear whether there's any need to link them. Yeah,
exactly. Yes, that is definitely an issue, and we shouldn't lose sight of it, but by also trying to improve the educational attainment of, for example, kids with an Afro-Caribbean background who also, the stats show don't do particularly well in school, shouldn't be at the expense of, neither should be at the expense of the other, should they? And you shouldn't set the two against each other as if it's a zero-sum game, and that very much felt like that's what that report was doing.
It's actually a very strange thing to do, right? To say this group of kids is not getting the best out of our system, so we shouldn't think about like helping a group of kids who are not getting the best out of our system, because it's a different group and we need to set them against each other.
But that's what the conversation about race becomes so easily, isn't it? Because it is about privilege rather than acknowledging the pain. So we're like, okay, how do we fix a group, or how do we... But actually, even just getting to the point of seeing there's an exceptional thing that's happening here, and yes, maybe there are certain groups of white underprivileged boys who have an equal problem in the education system, but they're still not the one who getting stopped and searched on the streets. So there's another dimension to race other than just these various social access questions that is often brushed aside.
Yeah.
And we've heard this in some of our, think of Keith's story, or think of also Michael, or Esther. Both of those two last guests I mentioned didn't really say that the race story was central to their own narratives. But nonetheless, they had to have narratives about it. They had to. This is a question they had to wrestle with, and you just don't have that as a white person in a white environment.
Yeah, and sometimes I think the things that people have been picking recently, the metrics that people have been picking to talk about, they've been picking the ones that show that there's no problem and we should all just carry on as if everything's fine.
Right. And history doesn't matter because we're over that now. It's better than it was. So therefore, let's not talk about the segregation, the stories, the inherited inequalities, the fact that we've only just finished paying reparations to the enslavers. Like, all of that just somehow doesn't matter because we're trying our best now. That doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it's not about inflaming it. It's about learning from the past. It's about picking up those ideas and ways of looking at the world and ways of helping, quote unquote, that have led us to colonialism that we need to be careful of. And that's why we should be thinking about the past. That's why we should be acknowledging the pain. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. I was just struck back a bit by that.
Yeah. So, so that's all going on right now. So maybe we'll have more mature thoughts about that sentence and things in future. But anyway, there's a little bit of live reaction for you, listener. So let's go back to the homework. So, Jörg, do you want to go first? A passage in the Bible that's problematic or worrying in this area?
Sure, yeah. To come back to our homework, I mean, as we had agreed last time, we were going to find verses in the Bible that were extra racist. So
it's such a Justice Warriors thing to do.
Yes.
Are you just going to edit that in?
Until Leah ratted us out to ourselves, exactly. Yeah. So I picked Ezra 9. Which I think might also be an interesting place to start. But so I think for me, the point of this is I do not want to gloss over the horrible things that are in the Bible, because I think they're important for us to learn from. And there's a way of too quickly jumping over this, either by saying, well, that was in the past, New Testament does it differently. It doesn't really, and we'll get to that at some point. Mm-hmm. Or to say, yeah, but the overall story of the Bible is much, much better. Yes, maybe it is, but this stuff is still in there. Mm-hmm. And I think we can't jump too quickly over it. And I think that's why we should go into these painful verses. And this is why we set this for our homework all those weeks ago. Mm-hmm. Anyway, here's Ezra 9. He prays about intermarriage. So the narrative goes, after these things have been done, the leaders came to me and said, came to Ezra and said, the people of Israel, including the priests and the Levites, have not kept themselves separate from the neighboring peoples with their detestable practices, like those of the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. They have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, and have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them. And the leaders and officials have led the way in this unfaithfulness. When I heard this, I tore my tunic and cloak, pulled hair from my head and beard, and sat down appalled. Then everyone who trembled at the words of the God of Israel gathered around me because of this unfaithfulness of the exiles. I sat there appalled until the evening sacrifice. Then at the evening I rose from my self-abasement with my tunic and cloak torn, and fell on my knees with my hands spread out to my God and prayed, "Oh my God, I am too ashamed and disgraced to lift up my face to you, my God." And so on. He prays about this, and Israel confesses their sins in chapter 10. The wives are then sent away, and then the entire book of Ezra closes with a named list of those guilty of intermarriage. So this is a story of the people of Israel who've just returned from exile, from being subjected to racial profiling themselves, of being exiles out there and being abused and being led into slavery. And now they're able to rebuild their land. And the first thing they're doing is going on this purity jihad, as it were, or this sort of...
Does it say what God thought about all this?
Let me see. Well, he returns, but no God.
I didn't notice God saying anything.
No, it doesn't seem to be, but it's... there's this confession that happens, and obviously it's here for an example, so, it made it into the Bible. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it isn't an instruction, as it were. Mm-hmm. I think what I find interesting about it is not like... It's complicated, and the translation of race is a problem. There's a lot of history in here in the sense that Israel felt that it lost its identity. It was led into exile precisely because of these things that they've been doing, that they have been intermarrying with people and accepting their culture and their religion. They've been unfaithful to God. They've been unfaithful to this calling to be the special people of Israel. And now they're back. They're deeply traumatized people, and they believe all of this happened to them because they did these things before. So if they could hold themselves pure, if they could hold on to that identity that they found in exile, then everything would be all right. And so you can see how closely a positive identity is linked with sort of racist behavior, and how closely trauma is to this kind of exiling of others and inflicting trauma on others. So
doesn't sound at all relevant to the modern day. I know you won't want to go there, but anyway.
No, I don't want to go there because of my own heritage. I don't think I deserve to comment. But
I think it has to be said why you don't want to go there. But yes, I understand.
But I think it extends beyond that too. It extends also to us that there is a real pain in those people holding on to nationalist ideals. There is a real search for unity. There's a real search for identity, for harmony. And for some reason, our default position for that is to settle on a sort of small concept of family.
Harmony and purpose.
Yeah.
You justify those that die by wearing the badge. They're the chosen whites. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge. They're the chosen whites. You justify those that died. They're the chosen whites.
Right, anyway, so we've gone way beyond our homework. We're well into our Worriers. Well, let's do Leah's homework now and then see where we go from there.
Okay, so I had Matthew 15, which is a story
Good find.
about Jesus. I know, it's almost like some theologian pointed me in the right direction. This is about the faith of a woman that is called a Canaanite in Matthew, and in Mark she's called someone from Syrophoenicia. So either way, she's not an Israelite or a Jew. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon, so outside of his sort of Jewish homeland. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, it is, Lord," she said. "Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed at that moment. So this is such an intriguing story because you could almost pose it as Jesus having his mind changed. That why was he saying those things in the first place? Was it just to draw her out, to goad her in her suffering, to make a kind of theological point of a woman whose daughter is demon possessed? It's really hard to kind of get your head around it. Or does he initially think that, does he initially believe what he says? "I was sent to the lost sheep of Israel." Does she winkle out of him a miracle? It's a really intriguing story.
Yeah, and it's almost like the hurdle for her is bigger, right? Because we don't get closure to the story. There's no now I realize, or therefore we're all sent to everybody, or if you have faith, it doesn't matter where you belong what you belong to.
Was she the
left
exception?
without comment.
Yeah. Was she the
and
exception?
she has to submit to this. I mean, you read, "Yes, it is, Lord," but is that what it says in your translation? Because it makes it sound like
Lord.
if Jesus says it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs, if she says, "Yes, it is, Lord," it makes it sound like she's contesting, but she's not. She's actually agreeing. She's saying, "Yes, Lord, I know, but we at least get the crumbs, don't we?"
That's the NIV. I don't know if it's...
Is it? I have an older NIV, I guess. It says, "Yes, Lord."
Interesting.
Because the "yes, it is" makes it sound like...
Yeah, as I read it, it felt kind of different to what I'd read before. So.
Yeah. Because she actually has to submit to that racist vision of the world, or this.
She has to say, "Yes, we are
racist
the
is probably
dogs."
the wrong way to say it, but sorry, go ahead.
She has to say, "Yes, we're the dogs.
Yeah.
But please, can we have a scrap?" I mean, it's unbelievably offensive.
Yeah.
And now put yourself in the early church, where you have the deacon issue in Acts 6, if that is historical, where the certain women aren't getting enough bread. They are not getting the same care looked after. If this story is going around, I mean, it wouldn't have been written down at this point because Matthew is younger, but if that story was going around, then you could work within that framework. Yeah, Jesus did it, but he did it exceptionally. You had to bring extra faith. And then it ends up in a gospel as a testimony to that site. Yes, Jesus changes his mind, she can goad him out, but it's never really corrected. I suppose in Matthew it does get corrected, because after and this is what then often theologians will point to, they will say, well, after Jesus died and resurrected, it just wasn't time yet. And then the Great Commission sends the disciples out to all people. In Mark, who also reports a story, that doesn't happen. So in some sense, Matthew is putting that story in a sequence by saying, well, for Jesus, this wasn't yet the time. So he gets called out by this woman because of her great faith, and she can overcome it. And then it universalizes after Jesus' resurrection, because that's when all the unification happens.
That would be easier to swallow. If Jesus said, this isn't the right time, or even I wasn't called to you, that would be easier to swallow than... he volunteers the metaphor about dogs.
Yeah.
One interesting take I did read on it was that it's not a coincidence that it's then followed by the feeding of 4,000, and that they would primarily have been Gentiles because of where he was. So if you go back to Mark, he previously feeds the 5,000, and they would have been Israelites. And then he feeds the 4,000 after this, so that it's kind of a acknowledging of an expansion of his mission, but that's just one way to take it.
Something that I think we're going to talk about later is the kind of the strategy that I'm quite familiar with of taking problematic passages and gradually figuring out a way to understand them so that it's all fine. Right, so the way to understand this so it's all fine is Jesus's eyebrow was kind of through the roof when he was saying these things, right? He's like, surely it's the children scraps dogs thing, and she's like, and it's all like him like showing the absurdity of it.
He could hardly make out his voice because his tongue was pressed so firmly in his cheek. But the rougher question is actually, you get to writing down these stories. Mark, we think about 60, 70 AD at the earliest. Matthew, 110. So the church is already fairly firmly established. It's an underground community in many areas. It is an international community. It long consists of Jews and Greeks and others. And you say, let's keep that story. Let's put it in. And we're not explaining it. We're putting it in like it is. So it kind of shows maybe an honesty that there's still a rawness.
Okay, so I'm gonna do my bit of homework, and then we'll move on to our worries. We're obviously already into them. So I suggested one of the bits in Joshua where they kill everyone, including the women and children. And there's some pretty gory bits in there, but but fortunately Jörg was here to guide me to a better one, so I've gone for 1 Samuel 15.
Yeah, if you want a horrible Bible passage for a birthday card, just get in touch.
This would be, you wouldn't put this on many types of card. So 1 Samuel 15 verse 3. So there, this is God speaking, or the Lord of hosts speaking. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So, that's a command to commit genocide, and on its own that's very disturbing. In the context of race, I think if you just took that command on its own, it wouldn't necessarily have to be about race. But when you take it in the context of the Ezra verses and loads of others like that, about the kind of purity of the holy nation, it very much seems like it is about race, and it's about not mixing. You've got to destroy them all, because otherwise you'll end up polluting yourself by mixing with them. This is often, in that kind of keep on talking until you've found a reasonable way to interpret it way, the kind of the impurity there is often, we often think of that as like a religious impurity. Like, you know, so the racial stuff is like a coincidence, and actually what God's interested in is you mustn't mix with their religion.
Right. Yeah.
But are we adding that? Are we adding that in order to make ourselves feel better? Does that even make it better?
Yeah, and I mean the entire brutality of it, the fact that Saul then gets reprimanded for sparing the animals, which we like to translate into greed, right? So he keeps the king. He does the usual thing that you're supposed to do.
Right.
You kill the people and you take the spoil. And then Saul Samuel rebukes him for that. And this is actually when Saul loses his footing as the king. And then
God,
we take
God
that
says,
to
I
be
wish I hadn't.
Exactly. God says, wish I hadn't. And so, and that then we take to be the good thing. That Israelite kings were somehow to be different in that they wouldn't enrich themselves on the spoil of the battle. They would just get rid of everything. They would just kill everything. And I mean, there's other verses like that in the Bible of also mutilation of male bodies after you've killed them and so on. I mean, the brutality and the honesty of what's going on is very much in your face. And yeah, like we said, I think it's problematic to try and explain it away. We need to look at it. We need to look at the depths of this to also realize what becomes of this. That it's not simply a misinterpretation to read the Bible and think it's right to enslave people, for example. I mean, we haven't even read the curse of Canaan or Ham's son, which then is used to justify slavery for hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years.
So, Leah, we talked about some Bible passages that are very worrying, but what are your worries in terms of us now in this topic?
I think for me it's this story that I've heard increasingly since the Black Lives Matter protests, something of a backlash, which is inevitable, but it troubles me that it seems to be rooted in a version of kind of Christian victimhood, that it's all gone too far, and it's all this anti-racism and anti-sexism and anti-everything else. It's all too divisive, and we all ought to forgive. And actually, the person who now really can't express their views clearly and doesn't have a voice in the public square is the white Christian, maybe man, but the white Christian anyway. Actually, we're becoming the persecuted minorities, and we have to be so careful of what we say in case we get publicly shamed and lose our jobs. That worries me, because there is a grain of truth in people's concern, but it feels very, very one-sided, and it concerns me that seems to be a peculiarly. I mean, I know lots of people think like that, but there seems to be something that finds its roots in Christianity of that view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my culture, for most of my life, was things are generally getting better in terms of things like racism, sexism, and stuff like that, and they're pretty good now in this country, and we should be glad about that and kind of move on. And that movement seems like it's basically saying, let's go back to that thing. Everything was fine. Like, you've raised all these things that are not fine, and I would like you to be quiet and go back to how things were actually fine. Jörg, what about you? What are your worries?
Somewhat adjacent to that, because I think some of the fear or the concerns comes from people feeling that they're being stereotyped in ways they're not used to, and so they're contesting this idea of white privilege and so on. And like we already said, I think it needs an acknowledgement of the depth of the history here. But beyond that, I sometimes feel that the Black Lives Matter conversation, not just on the white side, as it were, but also on the black side, has generated stereotypes of lives. And I think that's come out in the kind of interviews that we've had with non-white guests to our podcast who told us very different experiences. Some of that was unique. The fact was universal. The fact that they had to sort of wrestle with a question that even Michael, who felt like I feel like I belong in Surrey, saw himself confronted with perspectives and perceptions. For Keith, it was a much more raw experience, but still, in each of these stories, there was a very unique individual alignment of different dynamics that was playing together. And my worry is that because social movements need to galvanize these larger units, they need to produce these things, we still haven't wrestled with the depth of where race really comes from, that we sort people into these groups, that we don't want to look at people as individuals really, that we find it somehow hard to transcend into life worlds and experiences that are not our own, whether we're jumping racial experiences, cultural experiences, class experiences, gender experiences, sexual orientation experiences. So we're finding this somehow hard. And so we find it easy to still keep those groups intact and then say, what can we do to improve lives for Black people? And we're not really wrestling with race. Where does this come from? Where does this desire come from to keep you in that box?
Yeah, I think that really makes sense to me when I think about the people that we heard from. It was so confusing for each of them to think about what's really going on. There's not like this clear. So Esther talked about keeping her experiences of racism secret as like this sort of hidden thing, almost a hidden shame, you know. So that's her individual experience of that, which I think a lot of other people have shared, but it certainly felt very individual.
We should perhaps say she's since come out as well. She's written this letter to the Church Times where she talked about racism.
If you look in our Twitter feed, listener, I did retweet something that linked to that, so you should be able to find it.
So it's also an evolving story for many of us, right? So we're realizing new things, and I think some of the debate doesn't reflect that. It doesn't reflect the moving parts to this, but it always wants to bring it back to these very fixed identities. Yeah. And I worry about that.
That would be so much easier if there was a clear framework for each of us, whatever groups we fit into. If we could just understand, well, this group works in this way and this group works in this way, we could understand what's going on and how to cope.
And that is racism at the core, wanting to keep people confined by a particular race or cultural experience.
Yeah. So we can't do it, but that's why we have a tendency to do it, right? Because
I'm just going to disagree with your version of racism, but I think if that's your definition of racism, then German people probably suffer quite a lot of racism, and lots of other white groups suffer quite a lot of racism, whereas the definition that I've heard and find more helpful is that it's a historical construction that defines everything in its relation to whiteness. So it's not just about what group you belong to, but it creates a hierarchy of how close your group is to whiteness. So it's not just simply about the prejudice that sets you as a stereotypical example of your group. It's about where you fit in this chain, which has whiteness at the top and blackness at the bottom, and Irish and Jewish and Indian, all in the middle. Italian all the way. Some at different points in the middle.
I don't disagree, and I think it's very helpful to bring that up. I would want to nuance it a bit, though. Historically, I think you're absolutely right. What I was trying to point to is where this even comes from to begin with in us. that we want to compartmentalize people, because you can find people being racist outside of the white hierarchy pyramid. I see constructions like that in Ethiopia with people with one another. There's a very clear idea of who the Southerners are, who the Highlanders are. You have sort of inner African racial ideas. You have so and they don't all work against this whiteness bit. You have Arab versus African ideas and so on. So historically, you're right, because of that construct and because of colonialism, the fact that Europe got to define the racial pyramid and certain nations within Europe got to define the racial pyramid. And that's, of course, what makes these conversations very problematic for people who didn't participate in colonialism in the same way, even in what we call Western Europe, let's say Switzerland or and certainly Eastern Europe. But because it was white Western Europeans who defined this, we ended up with a racial pyramid that got imposed in many ways and then also copied in this way. But I don't think it's a universal, it can only work against whiteness.
But I think it's a really important point that we're not just talking about stereotyping, we're particularly talking about power dynamics, right? So even outside of the dominant, or the one that we think about most, there's still the power thing, right?
It's important what you say, because yes, absolutely. Like, we can't universalize it and act as if history hasn't happened. Like, the construct of race we live within is based on whiteness. I agree. I don't want to dilute that. I'm just saying it goes
No,
beyond.
it's good. It's a good debate to have, because if you lose the idea entirely of it being in relationship to whiteness, you do easily get down a road which kind of ends up in my worry, which is that white people are now, or soon to be, subject to some kind of terrible racism. But yet, if you just keep the construct as only being about in relation to whiteness, you do, as you say, limit its usefulness as an understanding in places like Ethiopia or in the ancient biblical world that we're also talking about. So maybe there's a particular sort of very insidious, very prevalent racism that is all about definition in relation to whiteness, but there's also other sorts of racism out there as well.
And there's white on white racism too, let's not forget that. So, Italian guest workers in Germany are treated, or think of the Irish, Italian, Polish jokes in America.
But but that can be kind of traced back to the idea of it's all in proximity to a white Protestant male. It's a bit more than just being white, isn't it?
Or new groups, when you trace it out historically. When they start arriving,
I don't know. I mean, there's interesting debate about being Irish, isn't there? I think we all listened not so long ago to the podcast with Padraig Tuma on was it on Nomad?
Or was it on something different?
It was a Nomad.
He's
I think
often
it was
on Nomad.
Yeah, it was possibly a Nomad one where he was talking about Irishness and race and how Irish people went from being the ones that people were racist towards in Europe, and then they kind of became white when they went to the New World, to America, and suddenly they were the white ones and they were dishing out the racism.
I haven't listened to that. That sounds fascinating.
Oh no, it's really interesting.
It's really good.
It's a good one. I think it's a Nomad.
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you. Now you're under control.
So one other thing I wanted to throw in there. So we've been using the Black Lives Matter debate as a sort of shorthand for like the anti-racism movement or something like that. The other thing to point out just about like when we're talking about confusion and not wanting to sort of draw stereotypes and things like that. It's worth pointing out, I think, that the Black Lives Matter movement actually is about something quite straightforward and clear, which is reducing the number of black people being killed by police in America. or possibly wide, it's then adopted in other places, but it originated in the US. So that is actually quite clear, and I wouldn't want us to be so keen to cover all the nuances that we didn't point out that it's quite a straightforward to understand goal for that movement.
Which is also why this whole all lives matter stuff leads in the wrong way, because in essence what Black Lives Matter is saying is, yes, all lives matter, now let's make this a reality. So black people don't get killed. So we have an inequality to address in the interest of making everybody equal before the law in practice.
Yeah, so I mean, the slogan of Black Lives Matter could easily have been All Lives Matter, so long as everyone listening to it understood that meant, oh, and by the way, at the moment, there's this thing.
And strangely, these are juxtaposed now. You think, well, how did that ever happen? Because we didn't want to acknowledge anybody's pain and inequality. But Andy, you haven't told us your worries yet.
Oh gosh, I've forgotten. I think my worry. So this episode is about the Bible, if we manage that, and my worry is that the way I have dealt with stuff like this, in terms of engaging with the Bible, when I find passages that I've found very troubling, like some of the ones that we've talked about, especially for Old Testament passages, what I've tended to think is, well, that bit is wrong. This is like my relationship with the Bible in 5 minutes. I found some bits I couldn't live with, so I decided some bits were wrong. And so I guess my worry is, Jörg, that you're going to tell me I need to engage with those bits, and have a much richer understanding than just dismissing the bits I don't like.
I was going to get the scissors out and we can cut those out of the Bible now.
Listener, Jörg is genuinely gesticulating with an actual pair of scissors on our video feed.
He doesn't have a Bible anywhere near them though, so I don't think he's that committed.
It's right here. It's right here.
Okay,
do you need a screenshot of this?
I don't think. I don't think we can actually have you cut bits out of the Bible, or we might be thrown out of various communities.
No, and this is not my intention.
I appreciate the visual metaphor.
I think that's where it's going to lead. I think we need to not cutting out, but actually engaging with it and explaining away as a way of cutting it out. And my mantra has been in this whole podcast so far to say we need to look at the pain to understand the depth of human depravity, insecurity, how we want to draw on an idea of being chosen. And maybe, and that might sound a bit heretical to some listeners, the Bible is infected with that because it's real about the human condition. And the salvation the Bible offers us through that still isn't quite free of those things. This is why then, we still have those stories about Jesus. This is why we have a passage in Romans 9, which we haven't read yet. So there's a beautiful universalizing story of the Bible that always has this vision of all people coming together before God and being reunited, because the Bible has the story of us all coming out of one family, Adam and Eve. And then that, almost like a mirror image, the story plays out, the world kind of explodes into all these conflicts, but God, through his salvation, will bring everything back together. So that's the larger story that you can draw out of the Bible, and I agree with that. And if you want only that story, listen to the Bible Project on, what was it called, on nation or national diversity, and they spell this story out beautifully throughout. What I think they miss, and where I find that flat, is all the conflict then gets just misdirected or redirected toward this one beautiful story, and you almost cut it out. You lose it along the way. And I think if we do that, we're missing something. Yeah, so I guess I would often see people like the Bible Project doing this like earnest work of like understanding the whole picture of the Bible and presenting it. Is essentially
doing the thing I was describing earlier, where you take a hard bit and you look at it harder and harder and harder until eventually you find a way of it being fine.
Right.
And then fit that into your picture.
Yeah.
So Leah, how do you engage with the Bible on this type of stuff?
Well, I struggle more with the verse that was it the one that you read, where it was God speaking directly,
and saying you've got to kill all of them.
Yeah, because with the first one that Jörg read, it was more kind of, well, you can say, well, that was what the Israelites thought they ought to do, and in the context of kind of the culture of the time and whatever, that was kind of that was acceptable, that they thought that God wanted them to do that. Mm-hmm. But I find it's more troubling when it's actually those words put in the mouth of God saying, "Go commit genocide." As you said, I can't rationalize that, and I just want to chop it out and say, well, they wrote it down wrong. That was
God definitely didn't say that.
God definitely didn't say that. That's really difficult. And I also just find this general narrative about being the chosen ones.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It might not be problematic in itself, but it is so close to a behaviour that is problematic. It's so like paper thin wafer away from the ideas of racial purity, and I think it can be directly traced back to some of the ways the church has behaved over time. So I'm probably lumping two things in together, so maybe take the first bit. But
no, they're absolutely united here, because the thing we didn't really read in 1 Samuel 15 verse 2, this is what the Lord Almighty says. So indeed the Lord Almighty, Saul claims, said this: I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. So as God was delivering his chosen people, the Amalekites betrayed them a few hundred years prior when they came out of Egypt. I don't know, a few hundred years prior, maybe a bit less, a few decades prior, when they came out of Egypt, betrayed them. And therefore now you got to, repay this sin, because they almost screwed up the story of the chosen ones.
Right.
And I rescued them then, and now you inflict this upon them. So, I mean, first of all, it's the same mechanics, right? This is how these genocides work. You find something that these other people did to you, and then you're doing it to them. And even though it's generations and generations later, we can still hold them accountable for it. And it's now God himself. And it is indeed the mixing of this idea of being chosen and that story not being screwed up. That's united here.
And this God sounds like the local God of a local people group.
Yeah. And, a good Old Testament theologian will tell you he was.
Yeah.
And maybe, I mean, that's one way of getting out that I feel close to. Is like, okay, we are discovering God as we go through history. But of course, that's not what everybody can live with. And it's also just another way of cutting out the depth of that story.
Yeah, that's the way I cut out that bit. I'm like, well, at that point, we didn't understand God well enough. So people wrote this stuff down, these words that God said, and I don't think God actually said them.
And then there's also this business about, well, in the times people took lots of plunder, and they saw war as an opportunity to profiteer, and different captains would have been even more vicious and hideous to the people that they came across.
International treaties.
Because they were all they were all trying to maximize their spoils of war. So by saying no, you don't get any spoils of war, everything goes, everyone dies, that's actually like weirdly more just. But I just can't buy it. I'm sorry. I have heard that. It's a good try. But maybe that there is something in that argument of how far could God actually take people from the civilization around them.
Yeah.
Is it actually possible for a God to appear to a people who live in a bloodthirsty and tribal culture and tell them a load of ethics from the 21st century?
Well, I mean, two things on that point. Strangely, we then praise the Bible for doing just that in some places. When Ruth the Moabite becomes part of the genealogy of David, which you also shouldn't do. You wouldn't want to do that. Mm-hmm. That sets a wrong example for Israel. Sets a wrong example for people around you. So the Bible has places where it then does it, and then we want to cash in again on that point and say, see how advanced it is? So, and the other thing, I would say, as a historical critical theologian, this isn't probably exactly how the story played out and happened. This is the story that's being told and rewritten and retold to a people listening to this and being educated into what it means to be a people 200-300 years later.
So it's partly propaganda.
It's yes, and it comes back to these traumatized people. I mean, First Samuel, probably not so much Chronicles then, certainly, sitting in exile and writing down these stories. So in Chronicles, we're certainly in the exilic period where Israel begins to write down its traditions. But First Samuel as well. I mean, it's been too long ago since I learned all this stuff. But this isn't written down just at the events. This is preaching. This is the history book version of it.
So those people in exile are hurting and trying to find a purpose and an identity.
Or even before exile, they're saying you shouldn't be mixing with these people, like we then have in Ezra post-exilic, because it hurts our identity. And now look at what happened to our first king. He got defeated by David. He wasn't able to carry it out, and here's the reason why. Because he was making compromises toward the enemy. So don't make compromises with the enemy. Stay strong, keep those borders up, keep the ranks closed, or we'll fall. And those are the people who then win the narrative when they're sitting in exile and say, this is why we fell. We made those compromises. We had the borders open.
So this is all very well, because this is me thinking, okay, so I don't have to listen to that stuff. But how do I engage with those stories and learn about God without learning that, racism is good or whatever?
Well, but it comes back to what Leah said when she said, well, isn't it amazing how current these stories are? Like, if I think of English-German relations not too many years ago, because of what the Fritz did, there was and is a certain perception of what Germany stands for. And that my kids in school, even when we first moved here, were attacked by their fellow school kids. Why did you do this to us? And they were genuinely, they didn't know these stories as much because they were young at the time. They'd never heard them told in this way. And then what do we have got to do with that? So in some sense, I guess what the Bible is teaching us is that how alive all of this still is. Like, we have to look at this not just as a problem of people back then, but as a universal human problem that we like to make these assumptions about identity and race and how others have hurt us, and that the only way to prevent this from ever happening again is closing our ranks.
So we take those little shafts of light, like the story of Ruth and like the commands not to mistreat the foreigner, and others that aren't springing to my mind right now. And we say that tells us enough about who God is to know that he isn't the God that said those words, because the contradiction is there.
Or at least there's another story that is also running through the Bible. I don't know where I stand on the thing God tells us, but there's another story that's also running through the Bible that paints a different picture and includes God lifting up Hagar when Abram's wife rejects her. And even though he says, "You're not the promise, I will look out for you, I'll make you the mother of a great nation, I have another promise for you." So there is Rahel, the sex worker in Jericho. It's a slightly different story, but she gets adopted, basically. There are, like you said, the commands not to, to include the strangers, Ruth, other characters coming through the Bible. So it's another narrative thread of universalism that is also there.
But we have to look hard at those difficult passages, and
we probably shouldn't act like it's all easy, right? Like, there's another way, there's a liberal way of telling the story that says, like, all of this other stuff is wrong, the universalism is the real thing. And then we run up against reality and wonder why those stupid white working class boys aren't coming along.
Or why their dads are getting cross at anti-racism and railing against the woke.
Yeah. So I think I'm weirdly attracted by the realism that the Bible presents us here.
Yeah.
The genocide stuff I find hard to live with, but generally when the Bible shows people being how they actually are, and God still being there and present with them in that's pretty encouraging, right? Because that's the situation we find ourselves in right now. I do sometimes find it helpful to think, imagine all this stuff. Imagine there was a God who wanted to reveal themselves to humanity. What would that end up looking like if that really happened? And thinking, well, it might probably end up looking pretty much like where we are, right?
We would probably kill him, nail him to a cross or something. We try to do that. But I think, like, the other thing, like, I was just thinking as you were talking, like, the stuff that's going on in Ethiopia right now mirrors the exact same thing. So we've talked about this conflict on our podcast before, and it's still ongoing. There are people being withheld from food aid because the government says it's not safe. There are contingents of the rebel army. There was a bombardment of a market town 2 days ago. About 60 people were killed. The government says this is an area there were rebel fighters there. They had been attacked and set back by this rebellious force. But the narrative they're saying, whenever this stuff comes up, they're saying, but look at what they did to us. They started this. They were taken hold of a huge contingent of the Ethiopian army and almost all the advanced weaponry we had. We had to defend ourselves. And they're the ones who got us into this mess about talking about nation, nationalities, and race. And this resonates with a lot of people because they want out. They want peace. So they're buying the story that says, let's rout out these people who have prevented this kind of national peace. And they're willing to look over the atrocities that are happening in the middle of it because they're looking for peace. It's that perverted of a world that we're living in.
And that's so familiar from the Samuel passage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then the international community comes along and says, genocide, genocide, genocide. America takes Ethiopia off certain dimensions of foreign aid and imposes sanctions. And that only closes the ranks within Ethiopia around that narrative. Allows China to come in and Russia. And the story continues. So we're so trapped in these kinds of dynamics. And a lot of this, and this is the second point I was thinking about as you were talking, is this comes part and parcel out of religion. We cannot act as if all we can ever expect from Christianity or its predecessor religions is to give us the answer. It's also given us the problem, or it's not given us. It's been part of the problem because we are humans. We live in it, and we are understanding, like you say, God within our context. So that's where we really need to be careful that we're not reading it too flatly.
Some of those in workforces.
So, Leah, I want to ask you a very difficult question. So you've mentioned on the podcast before that when we're talking about why am I still a Christian, you said like one of the things was the compelling character of Jesus. Pretty sure you said that.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you square that with the passage that we talked about where Jesus is like being really racist? I mean, is that the only problematic passage? How does that? What do you do with that?
I kind of argue it away because I do what you suggested and feel that he was trying to draw something out of her with a raised eyebrow. Jesus had this uncanny way of knowing what was in people's hearts. That's not the only story where he asks quite challenging questions of people. So you take, the woman when he meets the Samaritan woman at the well, it's not as harsh, but in some ways it's not a dissimilar kind of interaction. And I guess I just feel he had this discernment that knew that she was going to come right back at him. But that might just be a total and utter cop out.
But then what's it for us? Why is it written down? I mean, I think it's really interesting that you raised the point that it was written down at a time when the church already included lots of other people.
I mean, we definitely have a lot of stories of Jesus interacting with women, and I think the New Testament writers thought it was really important to include them. You think how many of the one-on-one interactions that Jesus had, the woman taken in adultery, the woman at the well, this one, were with women. And it's almost like this one pushes it to the very edge, because kind of, that it's not just a woman that he's talking to. She's not just come into his kind of home by the look of it, the place where he's staying. It seems to occur in a domestic setting. And yet she had no place to be there. And yes, he does fend her off a bit, but in the end, he gives her praise beyond what he praises anyone else. So it almost feels like this is the story that pushes it to the limit of how much we should accept people. And it wouldn't be real if Jesus just straight away said, "Oh yes, of course, I'll forgive you, or I'll heal your daughter," because that would be, like Jörg said, it would be airbrushing it. Imagine if the story, not that they left the story out, but imagine that the story was, Syrophoenician woman comes to Jesus, asks for healing for her daughter, and Jesus says, "Yes, of course." That wouldn't ring true.
And then
either,
washes
right?
her feet or something.
Yeah.
And then, so I was just thinking, how would we cope if Jesus was airbrushed like that, so that the values of next century or the century after were what we were reading in Jesus' behaviour now? We just wouldn't understand probably what he was talking about.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. But we don't like that idea, because we want to have a decontextualized certainty about Jesus, right? I mean, I entirely agree with your analysis there. It was a story that was being told. It was a story that rang true. And she wasn't just a Samaritan woman. She was a Canaanite woman. The Samaritan woman was pushing the boundaries because they were the ones who are of Israelite descent but had betrayed God, as it were, when they broke from... So they were kind of outside of the community. Canaanite was completely unheard of. And yet Jesus engages with her, so we can tell this story, but we're not telling it completely outside of our time, and we're expecting to say something else.
Wish it did, though.
And this thing was so key to the mission of the church, right? Because I kind of imagine this scene, like Jesus has gone back up to heaven. We're not going to go there. And he's sitting with God. Okay, this is like a story. It's not really how I think it is. He's sitting...
Is it a parable?
It's like a little parable. He's like, he's let these fledgling disciples off their trainer wheels, and they're there. And like the first big decision they have to make, the first thing they have to do is decide in a debate between two different races, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the next big thing they have to get right, at which point, like, Jesus and God are sitting on the edge of their seats, because this is where the whole thing could fall totally flat, right? Mm. The next big thing they have to decide is that, are they really going to agree with Peter that it's okay for people who weren't Jewish to be part of the church? So
without
this is
becoming
like,
part of the group.
without becoming exactly Jewish. So this is like absolutely ground zero for the church, isn't it? If they didn't get this right, or even partly right, then none of us would be sitting here talking about Christianity.
They are in the middle of this debate,
using story and hyperbole. But anyway, there you go.
No, absolutely agreed. And for the record, I'm not the sinister theologian who corrects everyone. No, I wrestle with the same story. Like, what do we do with Jesus going to heaven, and what does it mean, and all that? But maybe we do need to do an episode on that at some point. But I was going to say it's even slightly worse than that, because they're also at the same time not yet clear if they are reforming Judaism or forming a new religion. Like, to what extent are they leaving their own community, standing out in the rain, persecuted by the empire soon enough, for always standing in the way, and then having all these stories of and then figuring out what to do with Greeks and others. And interesting, in Mark, the woman is characterized as a Greek of Syrophoenician descent, so she's seen as this really mixed race woman, not just outside of Israel, Canaanite, but also really compromised by all this Greek stuff. So they're right in the middle of figuring out their new identity, and it's not surprising that things get raw.
It does. It's really struck me through this conversation how unfiltered the Bible is. How many things could have got edited out by people with different values over different time. And, it's remarkable to me how we have, the things David did wrong is the obvious example that everyone uses, but all the figures are flawed, and
also there's loads of things that you think, God, could you just not have left that stuff out? Because then this particular horrible heresy, where we all thought it was okay for the church to go around enslaving black people, or for Christians to go around enslaving black people, or even before that, for Christians to think that black people weren't really capable of receiving Christianity. All these things that you can kind of find an excuse for in the Bible. Could we not just have left that stuff out? Because that just makes this all so much worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what I meant earlier when I said this comes out of our religion. We can't just act as if we don't understand the danger of wanting certainty in the Bible if we think, in the 19th century or the 16th century, you just got it wrong. They misinterpreted the Hamite story, or the people looking for Anglo-Israelites, they just got it wrong. Because then we're missing the danger of some of the dynamics that the Bible actually reveals to us.
And maybe that's why it's easy for us to fall into that trap that I outlined earlier, which is, now we're at the point where white Christian Protestants are the victims, because we've drawn a line, and we're not seeing our continuity with what went before. We're just saying, well, that was where they all got it wrong.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
got nothing
Yeah.
to do with our Christianity today or our Bible today. They just had it all wrong, and everybody ought to just forgive and move on.
Right.
Okay, so that's got me excited, because one of the ways that I'd like to see the Bible is like humanity, with God's help, figuring out what's right and wrong. And I absolutely think I fall into the trap of thinking, we've now figured out what's right and wrong, so now we just have to kind of retrofit that against
Onto our Bible
against
reading.
the
Yeah,
Bible
nice.
and everything else. And that's the opposite of the lesson that I should be learning from that story I just told about the Bible. If the Bible is about humanity gradually figuring out what's right and wrong from God, we should absolutely expect that we're still on that journey, and we've got a lot to learn, and that would be a really exciting and great thing to learn from some of these hard bits of the Bible.
Yeah. And on that journey, I mean, there are good tones. We didn't talk about them, and maybe we do need to talk about them as well in another episode or so. We mentioned some of them, Ruth, etc., where we hear a different tune, a different sound. And you remember, like when Esther talked to us, and she's like, "I have a main song, and there are other things that affect me." And it maybe we can read the Bible, slightly alter that, and say, let's not let the main song drown out the other song, because we need to look at that as a warning. We need to see that that's there, that any main song can lead us there. So this tension we're seeing play out in the Bible between a story that tells us that all humans come from one source, from this one God, they're all created equal, and it goes to that place again. That's the main story of universalism, but we're in the middle of a messy humanity wrestling against that story often.
So I think that's really interesting. That leads me towards the thing we're going to read at the end. So I'll give you a chance to say anything you want to say, but we should probably wrap up fairly soon. But I think sometimes we've probably thought, humanity or Christianity, we have thought that chosenness was the main story. And we, on this podcast, we've talked about the problem of who's in and who's out, and feeling that there shouldn't be that thing. And maybe if chosenness leads us to that thing, maybe we're saying chosenness isn't the main story, or chosenness in the sense that the whole of humanity is chosen, or something, something like that.
Yeah.
And the main story is this family of humanity that God is working with. But that would be very challenging, I think, to say chosenness is not the main story, potentially.
Because go on.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, because we've extrapolated this sense of chosenness from the Israelites to now it's the church that's chosen.
Yeah.
So that then excuses a lot of the way the church has behaved over the years, because we have to maintain the purity of the church, and God only works through the church.
So I was speaking... I was speaking to my friend yesterday evening, and I had this kind of moment of realization that I had always understood the world to be that my friends who weren't Christians were basically not useful to me to understand the world. You know, they were good friends. I enjoyed being with them, and maybe I could convert them someday. But why would I talk to them about problems I was having or something like that? Because they don't get it, so they have nothing to offer. And I've changed my mind completely on that, and it's made me a much better evangelist, because now I talk to my friends about my faith as if they're human too, and they might have something helpful
Similar struggle
to talk through with me, and they do.
Yeah, that's really good.
No, you're right. I shared exactly the same feelings, same. Yeah, kind of. It makes you actually quite secretive. It kind of, that. Oh, there's a group of people that kind of get me, and the rest don't. And I just need to. I can only kind of keep my problems within the family.
It's quite lonely.
You can't talk to people outside about
Doubt,
or just stuff that's going on. But that's a pretty controversial view, right? That God is working outside of the church. I don't hear that very much in our circles.
The one thing that keeps running around the back of my head as an echo from our last podcast is that when we talk about inside outside, it's about not losing that calling without erecting boundaries. So in a sense, there's a sense of chosenness to be part of a story, but it's a chosenness that goes for everyone, and we tend to foreclose it. And I think that's a struggle that just really lives right inside of Christianity, and I think that actually really connects right with the reading that we had picked for the end. So if that's a good segue.
Could you just say that again, though, because I'm just struggling to understand what you meant.
Well, when we talked about inside or outside, we had this thing, we ended with this picture of the flame, where we didn't know where the boundary was, but there was a clear center. There was a sense of vision, of purpose, of chosenness.
Yeah.
So there's a danger of losing that when you say, well, God works in so many mysterious ways, and then you at some point you find yourself wondering, well, where does he stop working, and where does evil begin, and all of that. So you kind of can lose that sense. So I don't want to lose the challenge that I see is, how do we hold on to a notion of being chosen, all of us, or all of us being called and calling one another forward to that future of God, while not putting up the boundaries of the church around that, and then saying we're chosen because we're special. We're chosen to all be special, to all be there. So, and I think that's a tension that plays out throughout the Bible and that doesn't get resolved at all, despite the universalizing tones that we want to end on. And that's why I thought it actually connects with the reading we picked out.
That's what you're saying.
So we thought we might read from Revelations. We kind of mentioned this, and there's some beautiful universalizing verses in Revelation. So if I read Revelation 7, verses 9. So this is a vision that so the writer, the narrative eye of Revelation has, and he sees all these things that are happening or will be happening. And he says here, after this I looked, and there before me, and it's all end time stuff, and it's all very complicated, and has been a lovely riddle for Christians to play with for thousands of years. So he says, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. They were wearing white robes, and were holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." And then the angels sit around. And so it's a beautiful vision of and this has been a theme throughout the Old Testament too. Like, this was Israel's vision all along, that at the end times everybody would come together. And now let me do the Justice Warriors loop.
I'll tear it down.
Yeah, so we had this beautiful moment, and now let's tear it down. And then if you read just a little bit further on, verse 13, then one of the elders asked me, "These in white robes, who are they, and where did they come from?" I answered, "Sir, you know." And he said, "These are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple." So these are the chosen ones. These are the few ones that kept themselves pure. So again, you have this beautiful universalizing image from every tribe and every nation, but it's only the ones who did the right thing. So right until the end, you have that wrestling between a broad vision and a closed space of only a few will make it. And this is that is at the heart of what Christianity's been wrestling with. Yeah, since its existence. I don't have an answer to it.
Me neither. So, listener, we've this is an uncomfortable end, like many of our episodes, but I feel like we've been wrestling with the Bible, and I feel like that in itself is part of the answer, if there's an answer to this question. Essentially, we need to give up on the idea that we can solve questions like this, and we need to struggle with them, and hopefully we've helped you do that a little bit. And we'll continue talking about race in the next couple of episodes. Do get in touch and let us know your thoughts on what we missed, and we'll see you next time.
Kill it in the name of. Kill it in the name of. Kill it in the name of.
You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
Now you do what they told you. And now you do what they told you. You can't